This reminds me of a conversation we had over dinner after the conference where we were talking about how, or you were talking about how surprisingly difficult it is to sometimes answer seemingly simple questions in the business or with metrics. You have a bunch of great examples, but could you take us through one of those?
Yeah, so I think, a good example that's a little infamous in my world. There was like a VP who asked one day, how many people work at LinkedIn? And I think he asked like two different teams this question, and he got back an answer a full week later. So his first surprise was like, why is this a hard question? Like I thought you'd just email me by the end of the day. And then the second thing that really surprised him is that he got different answers. He was like, whoa, your numbers aren't like off by 5 or 10. They're off by like 5 to 10%. Like, what the heck is going on in these? And then the next thing that came was a document that described like all these assumptions. So, it turns out there are all these questions about like, if we're measuring how many people work at LinkedIn, are you counting people who are sick? Like, are you counting over what time frame? Are you counting people who have left recently? Are you counting people on medical leave, on parental leave, on some other kind of leave? Are you counting people on vacation? Are you counting contractors? Are you counting vendors? Are you counting, like people transitioning from an acquisition that recently took place? And there's so many questions there that we've actually started just using the term worker because we're like, you know what? When people ask the question, that's what they ask. How many people work here? You're like, okay, well, then they're workers. And there's so many different kind of legal definitions and HR definitions and privacy and technical definitions where you're like, okay, well, if you want to get really precise, I have to know what you're asking about. And I think one place that actually came up for us recently, or recently is in the last few years, we needed licenses for some technology. And someone was like, how many developers are there? And right from the start, I was like, I can't answer that question. Like, what do you need it for? They're like, oh, I'm trying to buy licenses. I was like, okay, give us some time. We'll come back to you within like a day. Came back, gave them a number. They look at the number and they knew roughly like the size of the engineering org. And they're like, these numbers aren't even close. Like, why did you discount it by so much? I said, well, you asked a very specific question. It was like people who actually interact with this kind of code or something. I said, we have very precise information about that. You don't need to buy licenses for all the managers or all the people in data when they're never going to use this. Like, we have a much better answer for you. And so I think that's one area that we actually deliver a ton of value, particularly around licensing costs. Being able to be really precise is a killer feature. But it can be surprising because people ask these questions and they're like, sorry, why did that take you a week? Like, what are you doing? I think, for instance, one more thing, and I hope this is a little shocking, but doesn't, get me in trouble. So we had a simple question: how long does it take to build code at LinkedIn? Right? How long does a build take? It took us like 2 quarters to really nail down a great answer to that. And there's all these dimensions to it. There's all this nuance to it. There's a ton of discussion. Like, we had to form working groups to define like what is a build. And I feel really good about where we landed. But it's the kind of thing that when I'd mention it to people, they're like, how could it possibly take 2 quarters? Like, you take the median of a bunch of numbers, right? Didn't you learn that in school? And you're like, well, it's a little more complicated than that. Like, median, you're just barely scratching the tip of the iceberg if that's what you're doing.
The one that is constantly you know pulling up my pants in my world is the definition of a team.
Yeah.
Particularly for like organizing these types of metrics and survey results. Uh, you go into an organization and say, hey, you're going to need a list of teams so that you can break down your data. And of course, the immediate reaction is always, yeah, of course, we have that in Workday
Yeah.
or whatever system. And then you realize this is actually only the department and the management hierarchy. This isn't
Right.
really anything about who's actually working together on similar work.
Yeah.
Then organizations, some of them have service catalogs that have these groups or teams of people who manage certain services. But typically that's more around like technical ownership and
Right, right.
accountability. Again, is
We get the same
diverges
thing. It's
from
like, are you looking at ACLs? Because that's
yeah,
not a team,
yeah,
or are you looking at the management hierarchy? Because that's not necessarily a team. Yeah.
yeah.
That
So
was one of my favorite studies we did actually. So we took a whole bunch of interaction data where we could tell, like, for instance, I commented on your PR. Okay, so it looks like we had an interaction. Um, so you take a bunch of this interaction data and you build like a giant interaction matrix, and then you try and model some effect. Like, okay, we talked a month ago, so there should be some number, but like a month from now, the number should like decay. So you build this like model of this interaction matrix with this like time aspect to it. And then you start asking really interesting questions like, okay, group Grant with everyone similar to him. Like they've all touched the same stuff. They all interact with the same things. Or, now imagine it like a graph and find me, are there any disjoint like sets in here? Is there a threshold where you're like, okay, there's a bunch of groups and here's the different groups and do they correspond to anything meaningful? Um, so we did that and the results were fascinating. It was like, oh, that's not at all what we expected. And for us, I don't know what your experience has been, but like teams typically are pretty small in terms of a tight knit group of people working on something in a very focused, collaborative way. It's not a dozen. That's pretty big. It's much smaller than that in our experience.
yeah, same here. I mean, part of it has just been a multi-year journey of understanding how different organizations think about and define what a team is within their organization, and then trying to kind of rationalize a consolidated working definition. But that's something we're still pontificating about more than we
Yeah.
probably should.